Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Among his many essays, Michel de Montaigne has a short one called On Lying, and the real core of it is a good ways into the essay because he begins by talking about memory, which is going to be an important matter in terms of how liars are getting tripped up and whether they can successfully continue to get their stories believed in. But he's going to talk about his own memory a good bit, and I don't think we have to say all that much about it other than he says, there's nobody less suited than I am to start talking about memory. I hardly find a trace of it in myself. I doubt if there's any other memory in the world as grotesquely falsely as mine is. And he's, being a little bit hyperbolic there. Obviously, he does have a good capacity for memory, but not the best. And he thinks that because of this, he's less likely to fall into certain other vices or problems, in part because he says an outstanding memory is often associated with weak judgment, and because he doesn't remember wrongs that much, it makes him better at friendship. He doesn't, remember ingratitude or things like that. And he finishes up that section by saying, books and places which I look at again always welcome me with a fresh new smile. So in a way, not remembering everything preserves a kind of joy and vivacity and newness to life. And then he goes right into talking about lying itself and the kinds of people who engage in this. And he says, it's not for nothing that it is said, he who does not feel his memory to be strong enough has no business lying. Why? Well, because there is an intimate connection there. If you want to lie effectively in the long term, you have to remember where you've deviated from the truth and which lies you've told to which people. So if you don't have a very strong memory, you can easily get yourself in trouble. And Montaigne is going to give some examples towards the end of his essay, but I'll give you an example of a good friend of mine who unfortunately died quite young, and he would routinely have a girlfriend and then cheat on her with at least one other girlfriend. And the first time that this happened, we watched him doing this and we were like, this is a bad idea. And pretty soon the two girlfriends actually figured out that he was lying to them because he lost track of which lies he told to which girlfriend. And then we thought, he's probably learned his lesson. And then he did it again. But this time he did it not with an extra girlfriend, but an extra girlfriend, and then a third extra girlfriend. And predictably enough, pretty soon it blew up. They found out about each other. And, this is his sort of MO. And he would fit into the sort of, stuff here that Montaigne is describing to us. So he tells us that there's a distinction that the grammarians make between two different types of untruth. So one is telling an untruth. Dire means telling or saying. Mensonge. So mensonge is typically translated as a lie. Here it's being translated as something that's not true. And in the case of somebody who's telling an untruth, like he says, they actually do in fact believe it, right? It's to say something false which one thinks to be true. And there's all sorts of cases where people do this. Perhaps they should have known better, perhaps they should have acquired better information, maybe they were being careless. But it's not quite the same thing as deliberately lying, is it? And so lying itself, he says, is something like to go against the testimony of one's knowledge, and so only applies to those who speak at variance with what it is that they know. And he says, these are the people I'm talking about as liars. So people who inadvertently say things that are wrong, erroneous, false. They're not liars. They are lying in a certain sense, but they're not liars. It's not characteristic of them. And what is the issue with this? Well, we're going to find out it's a really bad vice in just a bit. And he talks about two different modes in which people tell lies deliberately. So he says that kind of person either makes up the whole story, and the word there is invente, right? And he's going to use a couple different framings of it, and the whole, the entirety will be included in both of those, or they disguise and that's translated here as pollute, but it's actually altérer in French, which, could be pollute, could be change. He'll use the word changer soon after that. So, what they're doing is they're disguising and they're changing some source, some font, literally like the bubbling up of a well of truth, of vérité, right? And so there's two different kinds here. Some people just make stuff up altogether. Other people take stuff that is true and then they modify it. They tweak a little bit here. They add something. They subtract something. They put the truth in a false light. And so he says you've got two different approaches that you can take to this. So when it's a case of disguising and changing something, what can you do with these kinds of liars? You make them tell the same story multiple times because the real facts were lodged in their memory first. They make a deep imprint by means of awareness and knowledge. It's hard for those facts not to spring to mind and to dislodge the falsehoods, which can't gain so settled and firm a footing there. And it's hard, too, for the circumstances that they first learned them by continually flowing in their minds, not to make them lose all memory of the false additions and distortions. So you just have them say their story multiple times. You're going to see discrepancies. Sooner or later, they're going to trip up and tell you what actually is the case. So that's one approach that you can take. What about people who make the whole thing up? He says, it would appear that they're actually at a kind of advantage over the other kind of liar. Why? Well, because there's no counter impression, there's no truth in the background to rival their falsehoods. But because of this, he says, such a lie is insubstantial, literally with a light or empty body, un corps vain, right? And it's hard to get a hold of, sans prise. It's hard to grip. And so, like he says, it can easily slip out of a memory not extremely reliable because they were making stuff up. They forget eventually what they made up and told to other people. And eventually they're going to get caught as well. Now, he's going to move on to another interesting topic and tell us about people who chronically, habitually lie and what happens to them as a result. So he talks about Experience showing him that at the expense of those kinds of men whose profession it is to never utter a word without trimming it to suit whatever business is being negotiated at the time, thereby pleasing the great ones with whom they're speaking. So these are the kind of people who have to tell lies because they're dealing with people who have, access to power, prestige, the things that they want. A little bit later, he's going to talk about his tailor, who is always telling lies, right? So that would be an example of this. And he says that what happens to them over time? They're prepared to make their honor and their conscience slaves to present circumstances, but those circumstances are going to be changing, and so they have to change their words with them. So it's not like they just tell one lie and stick with it all the time. Because they're dealing with multiple, let's call them patrons, right? They have to tell differing lies, and it becomes difficult for them to keep track of who they told which lie to. Sort of like my friend with his girlfriends, right? So he says they're obliged to call the very same thing, first gray, then yellow, saying one thing to this man, quite another to another. And if the people who receive such contrary advice happen to compare their hull, what happens? Well, they realize they're being lied to. And he says, it's like a silly horse casting its own shoe. A shoe protects the horse. Throwing it off is not good. For what memory could ever suffice them, enabling them to remember all the various molds they've invented for the same subject matter? And he says, I've known several people who hankered after a reputation for this fine sort of prudence, but they can never see that to have such a reputation for it renders it ineffectual. If people know that you're good at lying to them, they're not going to trust you, right? So that's an interesting topic there. And then we get to a sort of moral assessment of it. And interestingly, Montaigne stakes out a really hardcore position. He says, lying is an accursed vice. Accursed is maudit, damned, right? This is a very strong language, right? It's an accursed vice. Why? Well, because it destroys what makes us human. It modifies, it affects the words that bind us together in society, in relationships. And those words are part of what make us human. This is an idea in Western philosophy going all the way back to the ancient philosophers that, other animals do communicate, but they don't communicate in the ways that we do that allow for sharing and community and disagreement with each other and, responding to and talking about all sorts of different moral values. And he's going to go on and say, if we realize the horror and weight of lying, which we often don't, we would see that it is more worthy of the stake, being killed, than other crimes. And he says, people waste time punishing children for innocent misdemeanors, tormenting them for thoughtless actions which lead nowhere and leave no trace. What should we actually be punishing or disciplining children for? Faults that as soon as they arise and develop are, causing trouble, like lying, and a little bit below that, stubbornness. He says they grow up with the children. Once let the tongue acquire the habit of lying, and it's astonishing how impossible it is to make that tongue give it up. So we want to curb the impulse to lying right away. And there's another consideration here as well. If a lie was simply the opposite of the truth, and there was only one opposite of the truth, we'd be okay. But, as he's going to point out, the reverse side of truth has 100,000 shapes and no defined limits. He cites the Pythagoreans who make good to be definite and finite, evil, indefinite, and infinite. One flight leads to the bullseye, 1,000 can miss it. So once we start getting into the realm of lying, it's not as if we can simply say, we figured out that somebody's lying, so now we know the opposite of that is true. There could be a lie that's an opposite of another lie. The truth could lie somewhere in the middle. We don't actually know. And so this is really quite important to point out. And he's going to give us some examples, which we don't need to dwell on, of people who tried lying, didn't really pull it off that effectively. These are nobles from his own time. But the point here is that sooner or later, liars tend to get caught out. And why is that? Well, we come back to the key point that he began with. Unless you've got a really good memory, you probably shouldn't be lying. And you may be lying to yourself about just how good your memory is.